Okay, let's talk a little bit about what we did Monday because it's a nice little review. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember right, we introduced the concept that there's 5 heat transfer mechanisms. There's maybe 3. If you do heat transfer mechanisms on a Google, remember a lot of that was just 3, the conduction, convection, and radiation. And those are called sensible because, oh yeah, I got my infrared thermometer here. See on the screen the red right there? That the laser has nothing to do with the detection of the temperature. That just says where I'm aiming. So I'm going to do some temperature body checks here. 88, 85, 94 on the neck. 93, lift up your sleeve. No, pull it up. There you go. Yeah, 92, pretty good. Okay, so what it's doing instantaneously, 83, 82, okay, 91, 93 on the neck. Isn't that kind of fast? You don't have to let it equilibrate because it's looking at the infrared color. It works in the dark. You don't need visible light. But it's just like, it's as fast as blue, pink, red. And so that's kind of neat to measure temperature. It doesn't really work super well on something like stainless steel, I found, because it seems like the reflection, I think, gets it. But otherwise, it's tremendous. You can take I'll show you probably next week, I took a picture of one of the Newfies when they were here, laying out in the snow, and what the temperature of their body was versus the ground on a sunny day. Yeah, anyway. So, conduction, convection, radiation, that's sensible. That means you can measure the temperature change when it's happening. Then the other category was what? Insensible. You can't measure the temperature change at the moment of evaporation because the heat thermal energy is being used, but it's being used to convert the phase change from water to vapor in water. Okay, so water, not solid water, liquid water goes to vapor. And then, of course, condensation was just the opposite, and I'll show you how many calories it takes per gram of water here in a little bit. Here's a new concept. Insensible heat transfer mechanisms, you know those two, can also be called latent heat transfer mechanisms. And I'll show you the definition of latent, L-A-T-E-N-T, because, you know, these online dictionaries are incredible. And here it is, latent, present and capable of emerging or developing, but not now visible or obvious. So, latent heat transfer. Okay, so I want to get that out of the way. And I guess since we're talking about latent heat in general, I wanted to show you, let's see, okay. I'm looking for calories. Okay, here it is. So, for 1 gram of water, it takes 540 calories to go from a liquid to a vapor. So you're using up thermal energy as measured in calories, 540. The reason I have that up there is because sometimes you run into books that say 600. And I think that's not even really rounding up right. But if you look down further, this process takes 600 calories. I think 540 is the more accurate. But if you see 600, you can say, oh, that's maybe a little bit overestimate. So for every gram of water that's evaporated, you're using 540 calories. Now here's the interesting thing is that's for evaporation, and you're losing heat from the surface that it's evaporating, right? But when you're condensing, right, it's just the opposite. And so the surface is gaining 540 calories of heat when condensation is occurring. Remember, those two are totally opposite. Okay, so then, since we're talking about latent, I threw that in there. But now back to the sensible. So it's conduction. You know, surface area is always usually a big factor. How much surface area is contacting for how much heat is transferred. So now I'm doing conduction, factors that affect conduction. So then temperature differential, right? And then, what's the third factor? Conductivity of the conductor, right? And so every material, you can look up how good a conductor it is. If it's a good conductor, it's a poor insulator, right? If it's a poor conductor, it's a good insulator. So sometimes you want heat to transfer, and sometimes you don't. If you have animals laying someplace, you don't want, and especially if it's cold, you don't want heat to transfer out of their body fast. Then convection, we talked about, and then we're going to get to wind chill here in a minute. Convection, I know surface area again was one of the factors. Velocity of the medium, could be air or water or blood. And what was another factor?
Temperature differential.
What's that?
Temperature differential.
The temperature differential, yep. And then did I say surface area? I can't remember if I did. Okay, so surface area for that one. So now let's go to, oh wait a minute, let's do wind chill. Yep. Okay, so Colleen looked up, it's 33 degrees out there and 19 miles per hour wind. So let's look up the wind chill. Now remember, wind chill doesn't really exist, right? You can't go outside. Once we show you the table for wind chill, I could never measure it out there. There's no, everything's the same temperature out there. The trees, I mean, a motor would, if that just got shut off, it'd be warmer, but everything outside is the same. Just like in here, if I measure everything, it's 74 degrees. Here, everything's 74. Even the table, it's 74. The floor, because it's equilibrated, right? Now if I had one of you get up, I could measure the chair where you're sitting and it wouldn't be 74, right? It's going to be warmer because you're transferring heat. So wind chill is kind of a man-made factor. It doesn't affect anything outside that's the same temperature as the wind, because the wind coming at you is 33 degrees today. It doesn't, you know, we'll look at the wind chill. There's, you know, it's 33 degrees coming at you. But if you have something to heat to lose, you're going to have, here's the best way to look at it. There's an interface between, let's say, your body or an animal's body and then the air outside. And if it's still air, then there's no wind chill, okay? 0 miles per hour equals no wind chill. Because the two surfaces are like looking at each other and they're going to try to equilibrate, but you're going to lose heat to the air because the air out there is 33 degrees. That's ambient temperature. And so you're going to heat up the air around you a little bit. But think of that, this is my hand, my right hand is the wind, the surface of the wind. If you move it and replace it with a new face of air, then you're going to lose more heat. You're going to keep losing heat because you're continually exposing your surface to 33, but then it warms up to 34, but then now you replace it with 33. You're keeping that gradient. So the wind is always changing the interface. So then let's look up wind chill, because there's all these tables out there. Here's one I found. I just searched wind chill. And remember, it's a man-made thing. You always have two factors. You have temperature, the absolute temperature, which is 33. I'll just call it 30. And then 19 miles per hour. That's right there. So the wind chill would be 17 degrees. Okay? It's, let's say it's 30 degrees up here because I'm generalizing here a little bit. But with the wind, right here it's 17. But look at how wind affects it. And it's not terrible at 30. It doesn't go down very fast. But let's say it's minus 20. As soon as you start doing, so, and here's the other thing. Notice how minus 20, calm means 0, right? Calm is 0. So as you go down, even just 5 miles an hour is 14 more degrees lower. And then 41, 45. And then they try to tell you, when will frostbite occur? Okay, so frostbite in this region, if you expose your skin for 30 minutes, it will occur. Here it's 10 minutes. Here it's 5 minutes. Now, someplace in my past, when I lived in Fargo, North Dakota, if you've ever, Fargo, it's not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. And there's always wind coming out of Canada. It's pretty flat. And I remember when I was in graduate school going out to the hog farm, and the radio man said, minus 80 below wind chill today. Now, they've modified the chart a little bit. I think they've made the temperatures less, because to get 80 below wind chill, you have to like be off here someplace, and it's not too far away from probably what it was. It might have been 30 below zero. So now, let's say if it was 30 below zero when I was out there going to the swine farm, it would have been something in here. Maybe it was, on that chart, it was 67. But I remember the radio guy says, it's minus 80 below. Don't expose any skin because it's going to freeze. So, yeah, a lot of wind up there. Dangerous, actually. Okay, so that's wind chill chart. You can always look it up. It's artificial. The tree has no idea because it's 33 degrees out there. The tree is now. And the wind coming at it's 33 degrees. So there's no temperature difference, right? So there's no exchange of temperature. There's no loss, no transfer. Okay, so then let's go to the third sensible heat transfer mechanism, radiation, which we didn't talk much about. So that's electromagnetic waves. We said it can travel in a vacuum. That's why we can get heat from the sun, right? Space is a vacuum, and I can radiate to the wall. It can radiate to me. We've seen all those things. So let's talk about factors that affect radiation, because it's very interesting. How much heat is transferred by radiation? Well, surface area again pops up. Okay. The more, like if you're standing in the sun, if you're standing broadside, you have more surface area facing the sun. The sun sees more of you. Or if you turn sideways, it sees less of you. So you can affect how much surface area is exposed to radiation. Then temperature difference is also, because if the wall and I were the same temperature, we're not going to have any net movement of heat by radiation. But I'm warmer than the wall. See, so I can do that real fast. My arm is 85 and the wall is like 73. So I'm going to radiate to the wall in a net amount. So I can lose heat to the wall. Then radiation has an interesting thing, that a factor that affects it, but no other heat transfer mechanism. Color. Color affects how much heat is transferred by electromagnetic waves. And the Holstein cow is the best example. On a sunny day in wintertime, go out to a Holstein cow and put your hand on her black spots and then her hand on her white spots. The black spots will be warmer because black is a color that absorbs the most electromagnetic waves. So if it's cold out and sunny day, the more dark clothes you have on, the more heat you're going to absorb from the sun. If it's hot, you live in like the Middle East or Phoenix, you try to wear white or light colored clothes. And if you ever visit Phoenix or Tucson, all the homes tend to be very lightly painted, light colors, because reflects the most radiant heat, okay? So white is your best color to reflect. Black is the best color to absorb. And so you can take advantage of that if you so desire. Okay, so that's radiation, electromagnetic waves traveling through space or air. And color is a big factor, surface area, temperature differential, and that's about it. Okay, so then let's talk about the latent heat mechanisms, factors that affect those mechanisms. Okay, so one, we'll do evaporation. Obviously, surface area. The more surface area you have for evaporation, the more total heat that is lost. Okay? And then, humidity. The ambient humidity affects how much water changes from liquid to vapor. So if there's zero humidity, that's when you get your most evaporation. And if you happen to visit or live in Phoenix or Tucson, everything's evaporating. Those people that live there are always, in the summer, are always walking around with a water bottle. Because once you feel thirsty, it's too late. They know that they have to drink water all the time, even though you can't see sweat. Because as soon as any drop of moisture appears on the skin, boom, it's evaporated. I had a friend once that I went to graduate school with, and he was like on the faculty in, I think, Tucson. And I saw him over in Illinois. In Illinois, Indiana have a lot of humidity. He was sweating profusely because he was used to that dry air. And he had said, geez, we've had 2 weeks of over 100 and I don't sweat down in Tucson, but I get here and I'm sweating. Why? High humidity lessens the amount of evaporation. And so instead of disappearing, the sweat was still on his skin because there wasn't much chance of evaporation. So if you live on the Southwest, you're always drinking water, you're losing a lot of water vapor, although you can't see it. It's kind of misleading. And once you're dehydrated, it's hard to get back. Okay, so amount of humidity in the air is a big factor. Okay, and let's see, that's probably about it for evaporation. Okay, and then condensation, of course, surface area is important, and humidity is another factor for condensation, right? The more humidity, the more likely it is to condense if you got the right conditions. But remember, of the 5 mechanisms, condensation sometimes isn't even talked about, right? Not a big factor. So then, looking at it overall, in the winter time, wind is the big factor after the absolute temperature, right? Wind determines how comfortable your animals are at 0. Wind has nothing much to do when it's hot, okay? Because the wind is going to be close to your body temperature, and you're not going to, unless you're standing in a furnace, you're not going to, have a big factor. But the factor when it's hot out, the biggest factor beyond the temperature is humidity. Okay, so how humid does it get? And I'll look up a chart. It's called the temperature humidity index. So on the cold end, wind chill is a chart. On the hot end, you look at the temperature humidity index. And let me do that. And let me reset my camera while I'm thinking about it. Okay, so temperature humidity index. There's a chart for it. And we'll see what they have as factors. There's going to be 2 factors on a chart, right? Okay, so temperature, humidity chart. Okay, let's see. There it is. We'll look at one that's pretty simple here. Let's see if it shows up. Okay, so and this is in degrees C, but that's okay. So here's the temperature, and here's the relative humidity. And you know what? I'm going to try to find a different one because there are some for livestock. Let me try to find one for livestock. Now that I think about it, temperature humidity chart livestock. Because if it's really hot out, they always say don't move your cattle. Beef cattle, temperature humidity chart. I'm just going to enlarge it here so I don't lose it. So if you're in the red zone, you don't want to move your cattle. And here's temperature in degrees F. So down here, white means not a problem, won't be heat stressed. Yellow means there's an alert. Be careful because now the temperature's gone up, and then as the humidity increases, it's a factor. And then danger is here, and then emergency in this zone. So it's 100 degrees out, and even on a relative low humidity, it's a terrible time to move cattle or any animals. So that's called happens to be for beef cattle, but it's temperature humidity index. Because it matters what animal you're talking about, okay? Are you talking about a baby pig? Or are you talking about a dairy cow making 100 pounds of milk a day? And by the way, those two animals are totally opposite. A baby pig, basically naked with a lot of surface area, because you know that long body with the big sides, relatively, they have a lot of surface area exposed. The dairy cow, you can put this in your notes, she's a walking furnace. That's what a dairy cow is. A walking furnace. Pretty hard to cold stress a dairy cow. The rumen, if you measure temperature in the rumen down in the middle, 105 degrees. So she's got a furnace there. All those microbes are making a lot of heat. And so she's got 105 there. Her normal temperature is 101 or something like that. It's not 105, but she's got that big heat source. So for the dairy cow, and we'll talk about this next week about what's called the thermal neutral zone, the zone they should be in. A dairy cow gets heat stressed fast, because that chart would be different for a dairy cow. Because dairy cattle are already making a lot of heat. So it's always, like even at 75 degrees and a little bit of humidity, they're starting to get into the danger zone, or a yellow means alert. Now the baby pig on the other end is not a walking furnace. It's one of the poorest animals to generate heat, okay? So it gets cold stressed very fast. And just to give you an example, a baby pig likes about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. And a dairy cow is heat stressed at 88. Think of it. So they're opposite. Okay, temperature humidity index, because evaporation when it's hot is very important. So those are the two charts that you should be aware of. Okay, so now I want to go and talk about the thermal neutral zone. And it looks like I must have crashed my Google on that. So we'll do this. So here it is, thermal neutral zone. And what this means is it's a zone where the animal does its best. Now that's not the best definition. I'm going to look at some images here. So the thermal neutral zone, it's the zone where you want to keep your animals. And there's different charts. We'll do this one first. Thermal neutral zone, sometimes abbreviated TNZ. And in humans, they tend to call it the comfort zone. And there's always, it's maybe not even straight, but notice in the middle there's a straight zone. And on the left, it says lower critical temperature. That's where it starts to go up. It's, on that one red dot. And then on the right, it says upper critical zone. Between there is the thermal neutral zone, okay? And if you go cooler, which is to the right, to the left, notice how that line starts going up. And when you see where it says metabolic rate, you can also write down heat production. So when it gets cooler than that point, you have to make heat, and we'll do more of this next week. You have to make more heat to maintain a normal body temperature. This chart doesn't show it, but even when that line starts going up, your body temperature doesn't change. Okay? On the right side, now look at this, how weird that is. If it gets hotter, why would you want to make more heat? That doesn't make sense. Does it? Did they do that wrong? No, it ends up being, here's another kicker, you can't make heat lower than that straight line, that straight horizontal line. The only way that line goes down is if you're dying. And that straight line in the middle there is called the basal metabolic rate, BMR. You can't produce less heat than basal metabolic rate unless you're dying. If you're alive, you've got to make so much heat per gram of body tissue, and that's called basal metabolic rate. So actually see on that left-hand side where it says metabolic rate, you could draw a little line right here. You could draw a line right here and put BMR, because this is BMR. Okay? So it makes sense to make more heat when it's cold. It doesn't make sense to make more heat when it's warmer, but here's the deal. Panting generates heat. So think of a dog. When it gets hot, it pants. Total, it's going to make more heat, but the panting loses more heat than the heat's being made. Okay? So this is saying what the animal's doing. So it's making more heat, but because the water is evaporating from the lungs, it's losing more heat than it's making. But that chart isn't about heat loss. It just says how much heat the animal's making. Okay? So between those two, okay, so here this zone, this is where you want to keep your animals. Because this is where they make the most milk. This is where they gain the most pounds of lean per day. This is where they lay the most eggs. This is where they're most comfortable, that zone. As soon as you go to the left, that metabolic rate, that increased metabolic rate, feed is being converted to heat. Therefore, feed is not being converted to meat or wool or anything, right? That amount of heat, it's kind of, in a sense, stealing energy away from the animal. But you've got to generate heat, okay? So, thermal neutral zone. Now, let's look at some more complicated ones. Because you can, I mean, these are all great. Okay, so there's the thermal neutral zone for this one, and let's see what they're talking about. They're looking at feed intake. So when you go cooler, they're going to increase the feed. When you go warmer, they're going to decrease the feed, although it's still in the thermal neutral zone. And growth rate. Okay, so here's your, you can basically, we'll just look at growth rate. I think you probably agree growth rate is the best in the thermal neutral zone. If you get cooler, growth rate goes down because you're using your feed energy to make heat. And then when you get hot, you tend to eat less, right? Animals eat less when it gets hot, when they're out of their zone. Because when you eat, the act of eating and digestion raises heat. Anybody know what that's called? You guys talk about it in nutrition. What's the name for the heat, the specific name for the heat that's produced due to a consumption of a meal? Anybody? Here we go.
Metabolic heat.
You could call it metabolic heat, that's one, but then that doesn't really say it's due to the meal, but you're on the right track. Okay, and there's a couple names for it. One I don't like, and I'll tell you the name I don't like. Heat increment. Heat, and then the increment, I-N-C-R-E-M-E-N-T. Heat increment. And then the other one that's probably more descriptive is the thermogenic effect of a meal. Thermogenic heat. And there's probably one more, and I'm losing it right now, but I'll come back to it or tell you next week. There's a couple names, but it's usually referring to the heat of due to the meal. Okay. So now here's another one.
Wait, can I ask a question?
Okay, good. Ask it.
So, you said you get warmer after you eat a meal, right?
Yes. Yeah. Your heat production goes up. So if you're sitting here eating a meal, your heat production goes up.
But why do you feel colder?
Why do you feel colder? I don't feel colder when I eat a meal.
Maybe that's just me.
Now, I mean, okay, but have you ever been like a restaurant and it's already kind of warm and you eat and you actually start sweating a little bit? Who's done that? I have. Am I the only one? Okay, there's a few of us, right? Because you're starting to digest food. Now, if you're feeling cooler, I'm not sure. Is it margaritas you're talking about?
No.
Okay, I'm just trying to figure this out.
No, it's like when I used to work at Payless, I would go on lunch and I would feel fine. I'd feel like
Okay,
normal,
okay.
and then as soon as I ate, about 5 to 10 minutes
Wow.
after, I was feeling colder, and I was like,
Wow.
this doesn't feel right.
Yeah, I
And
don't know.
It took like 30 minutes before I started going back.
Okay,
down, so-
okay. Because usually you generate heat. There's a couple comments. So here, Christian over there.
And all the heat starts going into your organs.
Well, yeah, your blood flow to the digestive tract is increased, but the thing is, your digestive tract is also making more heat in the blood circulating. So, I mean, maybe there's some cases. I'm not sure.
It could just be like what your coach's saying, because if you're thinking about like the heat of your body, the heat of your body is going up, but technically that also means that the room around you is now colder in comparison to what it was before you ate.
Yeah. Well, you're gonna so if your surface area is getting warmer after a meal, then you're gonna lose more heat probably to the room because the temperature differential is going to be a little greater. So maybe superficially you could feel a little cooler.
I'm just that
Yeah.
aware.
Or you're just weird, but I didn't say that. No, good question. Okay, so let's look at this chart a little bit because it's got the thermal neutral zone, but notice they didn't make a straight line, did they? So sometimes you won't see a straight line because maybe technically it does dip a little bit in the middle of the thermal neutral zone, like this, okay? But again, this is over here, it says oxygen consumption, metabolic rate, right? That's heat production. So when you get cooler than that, you tend to go hypothermic. So that's a new concept. Now you you're not really hypothermic, but you could technically get there. So to the left is hypothermia. So to the right, what is it? Hyperthermia. Notice death on both ends. There's death on both ends. So there are these extremes where if you go beyond, you die. So here's two new concepts now. Remember the zone is lower critical temperature, upper critical temperature, right? There's two more lines further out. And on the left, they're called the absolute lower critical temperature, right? And on the left was absolute lower critical temperature. On the right is absolute upper critical temperature, okay? So there's death on both ends. So, what's your choice? Die by freezing to death or boiling to death? And unfortunately, this happens every day, right? Death on both ends. Kids left in cars, pets left in cars, they die of extreme hyperthermia. And that's, what an incredible way to go. You're strapped into a chair, car seat, and you die of hyperthermia. On the other end, if you fall into some lake, even in the summer, you can die of hypothermia up by Duluth, Minnesota, because that big lake up there, I've been there. It is incredibly cold, and you can die of hypothermia. Okay, so let's look at another chart, because it actually is pretty interesting to look at all these charts because there's so many different ones. Okay, so here's a little concept. I'll look at this one. Okay, now, remember, it's always metabolic rate or heat production on the left. It's always ambient temperature going higher to the right on the x-axis. They've got the thermal neutral zone. I'm not sure of these abbreviations. I don't care about it. I want to talk about, remember, this is basal metabolic rate on the axis, right? Right here. What would you call it if that's the maximum amount of heat you can make? Because here's the kicker. The lowest amount of heat you can make is called basal metabolic rate. But there is an upper limit too. What's the upper limit called on this chart? We could draw a little line here and say that person can't make any more heat or that animal can't make any more heat, and I'm going to put a name to it. Summit metabolism, S-U-M-M-I-T. It's the most heat you can make. The most heat a baby pig can make. The most heat a dog can make. And that's the line where the absolute lower critical temperature is. So let's say on this chart, this was the maximum amount of heat they could make. Then down here we could say absolute lower critical temperature. ALCT, right? Okay. And let's go to another chart. I mean, because all these charts are incredibly great. Let's see. Upper lower comfort zone. Intake, heat stress. Okay. 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 No, it's not good. I'm trying to look at something else here. Thermal neutral zone, optimum growth. Let's look at this one here. Let's see if they got anything new on this one. Okay, so this one, it's a little more confusing, but anyway, there's a zone of thermal comfort, zone of thermal neutrality. Look at, but now over here, this is the zone of survival, this big area. So the zone of survival, if you're making a chart, would go from the absolute lower critical temperature to the absolute upper critical temperature. That's your zone of survival, right? And then again, they make the point, look at death from cold, death from heat. When you get beyond those two absolute areas, you have death, freezing. Okay, I think I'm going to stop right there. Good little point to stop. Next week we'll talk about what animals do to gain or lose heat and what we can do to help them. So